this is the kind of research platform that they want to make sure that you disseminate through. So we've basically got a dedicated team that organize events and activities and support those projects in trying to disseminate them more broadly across the UK. We've got an international role as well. We're trying to bring in international speakers and so on. But our challenge is the decarbonisation of heating and cooling, but there are other network pluses, and they include for transport, bioenergy and energy storage and so on, and our other kind of sister network pluses on the hydrogen for transport. Network pluses are for everyone. If you're not on that list, then please send me a message and I'll add your particular title into that list. So basically, they're supposed to encourage everyone to get talking about the challenges of decarbonisation of heating and cooling. And obviously, that's a very broad topic. There should be an event, whether you're an academic, a researcher, someone from industry, a social scientist, an economist, a policy maker, or involved in the funding yourself. So these kind of forums should enable you to be involved and see what's happening. Because it's funded by the UK Research Council, there's no fee to attend our events. And of course, we want, and there's no kind of membership or anything, you kind of just turn up and then you're part of the club. Okay, so this Network Plus is a partnership which has been established across Durham, Oxford, Brunel, Herriot-Watt, Leeds and Northumbria. And we were established initially with these set of partners, but this is just how we've started. We built on top of a pre-existing thermal energy network and are planning to continue to grow this and bring more people on board as partners. It got kind of key objectives for the network. Is the first one is to grow a world-leading research network around the topic of thermal energy, so that we can all communicate together and let each other know what's happening. This is obviously a very timely topic at the moment. It's a big challenge. It's going to cut across residential, business, industry. It's going to be net zero relevant. So of course, lots of opportunities to be involved in a network which is going to be rapidly changing. The plan is to try and bring together lots of the different stakeholders across the technology, across end users and social scientists and policymakers. And we plan to do that through sandpits, workshops, the possibility of doing secondments, research studies and public engagement. And then of course, the key then is to try and get people from each one of those sectors to work together on different key cross-cutting challenges, and we'll try and do that through some of our flexibility funding, which we will announce how to get hold of in the near term. And then, mentioning that again, so we want to expedite the development of the state of the art and create opportunities. So this is where we've set aside some of the funding from our grant to support a flexibility fund, which will do some calls for research around in the near term, and then also it will also potentially support some secondments and travel bursaries to make sure that when we can travel to events, that no one's frozen out of that process. We have kind of set aside kind of 5 core themes that the network works around. The first is about the kind of core technologies that deliver heating and cooling, your heat pumps, etc., or gas boilers, and the key technologies and their surrounding systems for decarbonisation. And then number 2 there is the actual underpinning technologies, materials, control, retrofit, and infrastructure. So that would be potentially the equipment or the materials that underpin the primary energy technologies. We've got at a high level, we've got what's happening with the wider energy system. Obviously, that's obviously got key element related to economics. So economics is obviously a key part of that too. And then 4 and 5 there show the relation of the technology back to people, and how do you shape the future world in a policy and a leadership setting in order that we can transition to net zero with less pain, as possible. In terms of like the practical element of the Network Plus, we're planning to have activity around 4 key areas. The first one is co-organized events, and that's one of these events right now. And we plan to have many of these over the 4 years. We've been doing most of them online to date, but hopefully transitioning to real world in the near term. We have a budget for secondments, so taking an academic and getting them to work in industry for a while to solve problems in and around this challenge, and also travel bursaries to support early career researchers to go and travel to our events and activities. And as I mentioned, we've got some budget for multidisciplinary research feasibility projects. And there's also a role as well in and around roadmap development to try and explain what the key technologies in this sector are and how are they evolving, and to try and communicate that to a wider audience who are now taking an increasing interest in this particular area. So in terms of events and activities, I would highly recommend going to the Net Zero Research website, because you will find out A, when events are taking place, B, I think there's now about 30 different videos from presentations, talks and stuff that have happened over the last couple of months. They all go live, they're all recorded on there, so you can go back and look at what happened earlier this week, hopefully when Jackie's uploaded them, but also our historic activities as well. So please go on there. But you can also click and sign up for our effectively a mailing list, so you'll know when activities like this are happening. And there are other platforms as well, if you're into social media, and you can also follow us through those too. But focusing now specifically on today, basically today's topic is heating and cooling sectors. It's organized into 3 parts, what we've been calling a net zero question time panel, where we basically have a panel of experts and we put questions which have been sent to us in advance. So basically the topic for the session is heating and cooling sectors. The session lasts about 45 minutes. We're lucky to be joined by Dan Meredith, David Jenkins, Huashan and Bill Kirkup. Over the last few days, basically what we've done is we've reached out to the conference audience and asked for questions for this panel. And then we've selected the best ones, and then we've shared these with the panel. So the panel know what these questions are, and they've potentially prepared some answers to them, and are going to give us their insight onto these questions. But the first speaker this time will be Dan Meredith. Dan is a senior manager external affairs for E.ON, and works on UK energy policy issues, leading a small specialized team, developing and leading the delivery of E.ON's public affairs and stakeholder engagement strategy, leading E.ON's retail market and smart meter policy development, and is an expert speaker on business energy use. So we will now hear some expert speaking on which sector will lead the decarbonisation of heating and cooling.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everybody. I think somebody's been taking my CV far too literally. That's no way an expert on business energy use, certainly not in this esteemed company. I think for me, and I will say, obviously I'm a policy expert. I spend my time particularly with government, but also talking to customers of E.ON, obviously one of the biggest energy companies in the country and elsewhere in Europe. So I'm not a technology expert by any means, and I come at it from delivery. And I think that's the most important thing in this question for me. Climate change is acting on a timetable, and companies like E.ON have to come up with the kind of services and goods that will help people actually make this transition to decarbonised heating and cooling very quickly over the next few years. So in terms of the question, which sector will lead, brilliant question, and we could talk about it all day. In very short term, I think the most important thing that can happen is that government have control over certain parts of the public estate, and therefore the public sector needs to lead. I think one of the most important things in terms of policy that government can do, and I used to work in wind farms, I've been in energy for a long, long time from the industry side. We've seen this in the way renewables have taken over in the power sector over the last 20 years. if you set a nice regulatory backstop and you have incentives for early action, that's how you make a change and actually deliver change. And one of the things that government is starting to cotton on to, and I certainly keep telling them, is you have to put in these regulatory backstops to make sure the market knows when it has to change and has that certainty over a long period of time. So I think the government now, we're already seeing some of these kind of sector targets and sector controls being put in place. Government can put in place something for the public sector. I think the private director sector is looking at a 2028 target for an EPCC for all the buildings. I think you could certainly do something like that for the public sector, at least if not a year or two before. We know we can deliver, E.ON are already delivering a huge amount through the local authority delivery scheme and other projects around the public estate. So we know, at least from an energy efficiency point of view, where it's about fabric and we know what we're doing, we can get that done.
Right, thank you, Dan. And next is going to be David Jenkins. David is from Herriot-Watt University. He's an associate professor within the Urban Energy Research Group in the School of Energy, Geoscience, Infrastructure and Society. He has a background in building physics and energy modelling, and he's been involved with the EPSRC projects such as Tarbase, LCF, ARES, and the forthcoming CEDRI project in India. So David, which sector do you think will lead the decarbonisation of heating and cooling?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Part of the challenge we have, I think, is that we can't really rely on a single sector to lead this. And there's the kind of slowness of the transition is because we have these different sectors, different industries with their own understandable motivations. And it's very difficult to then herd that together so that everyone's working off the same vision. So even when we do have a sort of a headline technology or a headline solution that we may have some confidence in, for that solution to work, there's a whole network of other organizations and other sectors that also need to be heading in the same direction. So a growing heat pump industry requires continued rapid decarbonisation of the grid, otherwise that doesn't work. Or a green hydrogen industry needs to be cognizant of other methods of curtailing renewables because they're almost in competition for the sort of surplus renewables. So how does that work? How do both those sectors work off the same vision? And obviously, just more generally across energy systems, there's this growing need to have supply side and demand side opportunities and sectors working off each other. So it's maybe the idea that a single sector kind of kicks in and leads this, and then other sectors kind of get into line and follow is maybe not how it's going to work. And maybe that's why the transition's been relatively slow in some sectors. But ultimately, I mean, my background's buildings, so maybe it's unsurprising that I think buildings should be taking some kind of lead in this, but it needs some sort of joined up policy across different sectors moving in the same direction. I think if you compare UK and Scottish government energy strategies now compared to maybe 10 years ago, there is a bit of this going on. So there is when one sector has been described, you can see how it's communicating with plans for another sector. So there is a bit more of that joined up policy. I think we've got a long way to go, but so we're starting to see that in more recent energy strategies, I think in UK and Scottish government. But you do end up with these lots of kind of horse and carts, but you're not sure which one's the horse and which one's the cart when you're coming through this very complex energy system. So which one goes first? And I suppose you get that that barrier about, well, okay, who does take the step first towards a certain vision? But yeah, I'd like to see building policy take certainly more of a lead. If we have great ambitions in terms of demand reduction in buildings, and then actually achieve those ambitions, then all the opportunities for how we serve the heating and cooling demand of our buildings, things become more flexible, more cost effective. But to state the obvious, I guess, the solutions that we would apply to our current building stock are quite different to the solutions that we would apply to our building stock in 20 years' time if we achieve energy efficiency targets for those buildings. So I would suggest it needs to start from what demand do we have from our buildings and have some confidence that we have energy efficiency policy that's actually going to be met, rather than put in the bin and sort of rewritten for another generation. So we need to have that kind of longevity of demand reduction policy in buildings, so that all the other sectors can respond off that, and we can, this idea that supply and demand need to be in harmony. So that would be the way forward that I would like to see.
Thanks, David. I think I should say that the chat function down the side here, please, if you've got your own answer to some of these questions, then yeah, please put that in there, and then we can all hear everyone's views. The next person will be Huashan. Huashan Bo is from Durham University, and she received a PhD from the Institute of Refrigeration and Cryogenics at Shanghai Jiao Tong University in China. She's an associate professor at Durham. Her main research is in thermo-chemical technology for heating, cooling, energy storage, and power generation. She's also working on solar PV collector technology, thermal energy storage, industrial waste heat recovery, and multi-vector energy systems and networks. So, Huashan, which is the sector do you think will lead the decarbonisation of heating and cooling?
Yeah, this is a very good question and big complicated question. But I think we need to be very ambitious to decarbonize heating, cooling in building sector. So the heating, cooling includes, in the building sector includes a wide range of and use application technology, includes space heating, water heating, cooling, and cooking and refrigeration, and all this responsible for around 85% of final energy consumption for heat. Emissions from these account for almost 30% of the UK emission, because the majority of the UK household and non-domestic building using natural gas for heating. Currently, we know that the demand for heating in building outweighs the demand for cooling, but actually the cooling is gradually catching up and could increase significantly in the future with the wider implementation of energy efficiency measure in the building and the impact of climate change. And for example, according to EU, by 2030, the energy use to cool building across EU and is likely to increase by 70%. But the good news is many low carbon solutions are already available, and many of them are in use in building now, and the government is planning to uplift the energy efficiency standard for buildings. One of the major challenges, I think, unlike decarbonizing the power sector, decarbonizing heat at scale will have a direct impact on consumers. And the change will likely include high capital and within building adjustment, and also the changes to consumers' heating behavior. And overcoming these barriers to consumer action will be fundamental for a successful transition.
Thank you very much. Next is Bill Kirkup. Bill has worked in the environmental and sustainable development sector for over 20 years. An experienced and qualified project and program manager, he has a background in action research and the design of initiatives for translating sustainable development policy into practice. And his main current area of interest is the green economy and the development of organizational and in particular area-based transition strategies. Bill, so which sector will lead the decarbonisation of heating and cooling?
It's a very old CV you've got there. It's closer to 30 years now.
Well
and it's perhaps relevant to point out the last 10 years has been mostly spent on evaluating policies, particularly policies in relation to heat, including lots of work on low carbon heat. So in terms of which sector should lead, I think it should be government. I know it's a sort of pat response. People always try and say the government should lead, but actually I firmly think that it is the government who should lead. I think there's a need to put in place the appropriate policy architecture to enable decarbonisation of heating and cooling, particularly at the scale and pace that we're talking about. by policy architecture, I mean a mix of carrots and sticks in terms of incentives and regulations. We already have some of that, and it is intended to incentivize. It's intended to reduce risk, and to risk as in perceived risk by investors and business, and to increase certainty. And I think all of those things are needed if you're going to move again at pace and scale, particularly if you're a business or an investor. Then you need to be have some level of confidence that the direction that you're being told we're going is the direction that we're going to go. And I think that does pose a bit of a problem for us, because there is a trust issue in the business, the private sector, because they've seen lots of initiatives come and go, and they do worry about the persistence of those initiatives. And if you like, that undermines the whole concept of minimizing risk and increasing certainty. But anyway, government needs to sort of deal with that. Recognize that there is a problem, a need for persistence in policy terms. But I do firmly think that they need to take the lead. Of course, as has been pointed out by other speakers, they're only one actor. They can't do it all on their own. Neither are they necessarily well equipped to do it on their own, and they certainly don't want to do it all on their own. So once you've got the appropriate policy architecture, then it's about the system, and lots of different actors have a significant role to play. Local authorities have a very significant role to play in terms of enabling heat networks, district heating, for example.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. The next question will come to David first, and that's, what is the next key technological advancement for the heating and cooling sector?
So I mean, I get as excited as anyone in terms of new technologies or an existing technology that turns a corner in terms of its efficiency or COP or whatever it might be. But actually, I think we're sometimes a bit guilty of sort of technology Saverism. We're kind of waiting for that magic box to appear that will elevate us to the next generation or get us to our carbon targets. And the problem is that with that is it can kind of be like waiting for a bus that never comes, and it just delays action. We're thinking, well, we're not going to progress with the current generation of technologies because something new is going to come, and we have to wait for that to get into place before we develop the infrastructure and support for that. I mean, you can do that forever, essentially. And one argument that's often made is that, for example, in sort of climate change committee reports and others, is that we do essentially have a bundle of technologies in place already that can actually potentially do what we need to do. And so actually maybe the problem is we're at that bus stop and the bus has come, but the problem is we don't know how to get on the bus and the door's stuck. And that's probably a more appropriate analogy for where we are, because what we need is better models of financing, mass scale installation plans that understand things like skills gaps that we have for installing those technologies, quicker to respond supply chains because of the sort of timescales that we're trying to work to, and legislation that generally matches the ambitions that we seem to currently have in the UK for low carbon targets. Because technologically, if we're talking about decarbonising the grid to an exceptionally low level, radically reducing energy demand in buildings, largely retiring fossil fuel forms of heating, and cementing better two-way communication between supply and demand, particularly on the electricity grid. I mean, these are all technologically possible right now. We arguably need more demonstrators, more demonstration projects to show these things working, so we can learn from how these things are integrated together. We need to advance our use of demand management and flexibility, and there are technological implications around that in terms of meters and software and data management. So yeah, we shouldn't ignore the potential for efficiency improvements, COP improvements, and so on. But I think we have been guilty for quite a while of waiting for this kind of magic bullet to kill this problem. We should look what we have, look at what we've got, look at what's currently working, and look at these more sort of practical, pragmatic problems, which is why demonstration projects are so important at the moment. And I think we're seeing these kind of things funded a little bit more now, because there's maybe a growing acceptance that we have this basket of technologies that have great potential. We need to put them into place and get them tested and think about how they work together, how they can be integrated, and move forward from that.
Right, thank you, David. Huashan, your next is yes. What do you think the next key technological advancement for the heating and cooling sector?
Yes, I completely agree with what David just mentioned. There are already a range of technology which have the potential to offer low carbon heating and cooling choices in the future. But one technology that I would like to highlight is the seasonal solar energy storage. That should be one of the key technology for future heating and cooling sector. We all know that the heating demand changes seasonally, and to mismatch with available solar heat. In the UK, the winter peak demand is almost 4 times of a summer demand. So in fact, the total amount of solar radiation incidence on a typical house roof exceeds its heating consumption over the year. So I think it will change the heating sector significantly if we can cost effectively store the heat in the summer and to reuse it in the winter. There are some demonstration projects storing solar heated hot water seasonally in large tanks in Germany, and storage volume is from 100 cubic meters or to more than 10,000 cubic meters, but not for a single house, for a community. However, such systems have very low energy density and the heat loss is inevitable. And sometimes the heat pump is used to boost the temperature during the winter. But the thermo-chemical absorption heat storage method, it's a very promising technology for seasonal energy storage because it has large energy density and minimum heat loss during the long-term storage, because the heat is stored in the form of chemical potential rather than a temperature difference. So I think it's a very promising solution for the heating sector, but this technology is still in the lab. We need more R&D effort to make it practical.
Thank you, Huashan. Next is Bill.
Yeah, so I agree with the 2 previous speakers. I think we've already got a sort of promising clutch of technologies. I mean, I should say I'm not a technological expert, so I defer to others on that. But for example, heat pumps, strike me as being a very good idea. And I'd rather than looking for magic bullets, I think we need to do more on, well, perhaps 2 things. I think there's optimization. So get better at doing what we're already doing. I'll come back to heat networks. So I know that quite a lot of work has been done on optimizing our approach to heat networks, and it includes things like financial models, which again, David referenced. I'd like to see optimization for me as part of mainstreaming. I think we have some promising technologies, so let's make them work as well as possible, and then let's mainstream them so they're operating at scale rather again than obsessing about new technologies. I also think something that strikes me again as a non-technology expert, but really interesting when I talk to people who are, is the integration of existing technologies. So I think solar thermal was just mentioned in terms of sort of, I think, interseasonal storage. I've spoken to people who are really interested in that in relation to integration with district heating or mine energy schemes and so on and so forth. So I think there's some fascinating work going on integration, and that seems to, there seem to be huge potential benefits there if we can integrate lots of different technologies in the smartest way.
Right, thank you, Bill. Dan, last up.
Yeah, I think I concur with what everybody said. I think it's been summed up very nicely. The most important thing for me is delivery now. Obviously, there's a lot of research around technologies that's got to happen over the next 10 years to get anywhere near hydrogen, for example. But I want to be installing heat pumps and getting energy efficiency done as soon as we can, and we're doing it now. We need to do more of it as soon as possible. So it's about that systems thinking of getting that done, getting the policies in place that make it work and the financial instruments that make it work. I think if stretching technology as a definition, I think probably the most interesting thing in my world that is going to happen is the way the relationship with, as an energy customer, which we all are, with the technologies and with the companies that provide the services and so on, is going to change over the next few years. I think E.ON's one of the biggest installers of smart meters, for example, in the country, and just having some of that data and seeing what we can then do with it and what other third parties can start to do with it with customers' permission, and will change the way we work with energy, and hopefully will give people a bit more engagement with all of these technologies and get them done very quickly.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, so please put your own comments in the chat. There's been a couple popping up there. I think we'll move on to the next round of questions, which we'll go to Huashan. Which aspects of current plans requires a greater level of scrutiny?
I guess there's a lot of things we need to consider about, and but it might. So the most things to concern in my area, I think I would like to highlight the importance of renewable heat source and thermal energy storage. Electricity is the smallest area of energy demand at the moment compared to heat and transport, but it has the highest level of attention by the government and the media. And in populace minds, energy storage is most commonly associated with electricity. But actually, the energy storage is needed for all forms of energy that we use, including heat and transport. And compared to storing electricity, storing heat in many ways more straightforward and require less running costs. So I guess, and another thing is, it's also worth noting that the energy storage is not confined to application in renewable energy. It also can be used with heat from any source like fossil fuel. For example, enormous amount of electricity, enormous amount of industry waste heat can be stored for later use locally or delivered to be used elsewhere.
Thank you, Huashan. Next up is Bill.
Okay, so the two issues that keep being flagged to me, and we do a lot of research, policy related research, so we speak to, well, everyone at some point or another and repeatedly. So two issues which are sort of being red flagged for me or to me by others at the moment are incentives for heat pumps. The various incentive schemes relating to heat pumps and district heating are undergoing review. New schemes are envisaged, and there is enormous concern in that particular sector about the impact of these changes. And in worst case scenario, we are hearing of a number of schemes being put on the shelf. So I think that's a concern in terms of current plans regarding the future. Again, I use the term policy architecture. The various incentives, particularly for in relation to heat pumps, particularly. I think the other thing which is really coming out very strongly at the moment, and lots of reports coming out about this, is green skills and the absence of capacity in the workforce, but also capabilities. So there's two things. It's numbers of people with appropriate skills, and then it's anybody with appropriate skills, if you like. In some cases, these are sort of creating major barrier issues for, in some areas we're being told anyway that, there is now momentum, that the initiatives are right. People want to build certain types of low carbon infrastructure, but they don't have the workforce one way or another to enable them to do so. And that is looking like a really major drag factor in terms of our, that will impact on our ability to meet our various targets. So I think green skills, it's not actually that anyone isn't looking at this very hard. So I'm not telling you anything that people don't know, but it's getting serious red flags all over the place from people I speak to.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bill. Dan, which aspects of current plans require a greater level of scrutiny, do you think?
Well, this is a great question. This is my kind of question. I love scrutinising a good plan. I think Bill hit the nail on the head again. It's all about policy and making sure that it's pointing people in the right direction to take action. The government plans at the moment are almost entirely focused on the poorest in society and the homes and buildings that need it most when we talk about decarbonisation of heat, and that is the most important thing for me to get right now. That's a great place to start, and it's a really important sector, but it's probably leaving about 80% of homes and buildings in the country without a proper incentive to get things done, which it needs. The demise of the Green Homes Grant, which we can talk about in lots of detail if we wish, is leaving a huge hole. It didn't work for a whole host of reasons, but it was the only thing we had really that joined together some kind of incentive for everybody to do something about decarbonising their homes and buildings. So as I said, E.ON is busy getting on with helping vulnerable people and the public estate and social housing and all that kind of stuff. But at the moment, we don't have a route to market for people that want to take action in a big way when they can afford to pay for it and they're a homeowner. That's got to be sorted out. And I think that falls into a couple of things. I think we need to see some kind of reform to the way energy bills work. That's one of the things that I'm very hot on at the moment, because as I think was said earlier in some of the presentations, electricity is so much more expensive than gas. So if you're switching to a heat pump from a gas boiler, at the moment you're probably worse off, not only in the upfront costs, but actually in running costs daily, and that's going to change. A lot of that comes from the way we're currently putting in policy costs and so on into the bill, and that can be changed. And once it is changed, then you've got a better incentive to switch from gas to electricity and use heat pumps instead. So that's a key thing. But we've got to find some way of working through that process for getting incentives to be able to pay market. I think financial institutions are the way forward. And as I think I'll probably talk about in the next question, I think one of the most important things is getting a sort of roadmap for homeowners individualized, so they know what they've got to do for their building for the next 10, 15 years, and they can start planning it out, because we've got to give people not only the sort of ability to get this done in an economic sense, but we've got to give them control and understanding so they can do it when they wish to do it, and it's part of their ability to do it rather than being forced to do it, because that just won't make it happen, particularly in the homeowner sector.
Great, thank you, Dan. And David?
Yeah, so picking on a couple of points already mentioned, so we're still miles away from what we need to do with reducing demand in buildings. So I mean, if I want to be optimistic in my area of work, in terms of what's happened in the last 10 years, I look at the carbon intensity of the grid, because that's moved on, and that makes me think actually this maybe we are heading in the right direction. If I want to feel pessimistic, I'll look at energy efficiency in buildings in the last 10 years, which is a completely different direction. I think we're still suffering, there's still a bit of a hangover from a sort of hiatus of energy efficiency policy, which actually dials back to sort of 2012, when the Green Deal, the old Green Deal, sort of disrupted the existing forms of how we supported energy efficiency in homes. Which isn't to say we were on the right track before 2012, but we had a platform of the kind of basic insulation measures and boiler upgrades and so on, which was kind of working to some extent. And then the Green Deal came in, sort of demolished parts of that industry. And as Dan was saying, we're now seeing different mistakes happening with the Green Homes Grant. I mean, both the Green Deal and the Green Homes Grant were complete shambles. There were different types of shambles, but they were both shambles. So we need to apply great level of scrutiny to what we're doing with energy efficiency and building policy. and the funding mechanisms behind that policy. We're seeing the ambition's been upgraded somewhat around what we need to do with our buildings recently, and there is a lot of activity around how we use energy performance certificates to grade the buildings. I'm slightly, in terms of what we should be scrutinising, I'm slightly concerned with the way energy performance certificates are being proposed for stopping the selling and leasing of properties, because that's not what they were designed to do. I worry about kind of using a screwdriver as a spanner. I think we're applying a tool to the wrong thing. I think there could be a big backlash, a kind of consumer backlash, if we start enforcing people to do things that actually have quite poor basis, because we're using relatively simple compliance models to get people to actually spend potentially thousands or tens of thousands of pounds on their buildings, and that's not going to stimulate a market. That's not going to stimulate support around this really important thing we need to do around energy efficiencies. So I would place a magnifying glass around building energy efficiency policy, the funding mechanisms behind that, and what we're doing with EPCs. I mean, on a slightly more positive note, because that was quite pessimistic, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of research at the moment now around using new metrics of building performance and the extent to which they can be aligned with energy performance certificates, or in a wider sense, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive at European level. So this is definitely something that's quite active in research right now, is that we need other metrics of performance, a more richer understanding of building performance. So there is something there, but we need to do it properly.
Thanks, David. So that kind of concludes that round. I think the next question, which will come to Bill first. So the transport sector has been given this internal combustion engine ban, which has been very blunt, but it's been extremely disruptive in its impact. So what kind of similar kind of intervention could be considered for heating and cooling?
Yeah, this is the question I feel least able to answer. So unfortunate that it's come to me as my first. I was hoping to get some clues from others. I have been scratching my head about this, and the simple answer is I don't know. It does occur to me, though, sort of picking up some of the threads from a couple of the people who've just spoken, actually, that it might not be a technological intervention. I like systems thinking, and you're always looking for levers and mechanisms when you're looking at how you're going to influence the system. So we shouldn't assume it's going to be a technological disruptor. I think thinking about housing retrofit, which is something we've been doing a fair bit of work on recently, that's a tough nut to crack, making that happen. But we've seen some very interesting work going on in terms of service design, as in designing a service for householders able to pay market who want to take action on domestic retrofitting. And there seems to be a lot of latent demand. Now, this isn't, necessarily a mass market, but there's certainly in some of the schemes we've looked at, there seems to be quite a lot of latent demand, which is desperate for a service mechanism to unlock it, to enable it to, to give it the ability to move forward, to be expressed. By that I mean, in the most simple terms, a sort of a retrofit advisor service, completely independent, that gives people the confidence to navigate their way through the complexities. Now, it is a complex subject, housing retrofit. So yeah, that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. It might not be a technological thing. It might be something as simple as, well, I say simple, it isn't actually. This particular service example I'm thinking of, a huge amount of effort and thought has been gone into that. But that does seem to be enabling, as I say, this latent demand to express itself, to create, to move into actual retrofits.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so others have described this question as kind of a hand grenade in the room and then running away. so I'll now pass the hand grenade to Dan.
Thanks. I love a good hand grenade. Yeah, I'll be very clear, and we're being very clear with government. This kind of simple regulatory backstop, as I call it, is absolutely vital because we know it works. It's worked with transport, as we're seeing. It's worked before in the power sector. As I said, I've been in the power sector for a long, long time. We knew coal-fired power stations weren't going to fly commercially 20 years ago, and that's why, one of the reasons at least, why we haven't got so many power stations working from coal anymore in the UK, and we've had to switch over to renewables so strongly. So we need this kind of thing in decarbonising heat and cooling, absolutely. I would say you can start with making sure that various sectors of buildings and housing are EPC by a certain time. Absolutely taken on board what David's just said about the EPC measure itself, and I'd be really interested actually to get into more detail on what we need to do on EPCs and how we need to change them, particularly to help some of these policy levers work and for education and information for actual householders. But that needs to be in place, and I'd absolutely be in favour of quite a simple gas boiler ban at a certain time in the future, and it needs to be a clear cross-party political ban and note that it will happen, and it needs to be enforced long enough time in the future for the businesses and the industry and the supply chain to make it happen in the same way as happened in, as I said, in coal-fired power stations. I think something at least by 2035 has got to happen of that order, and I think I'd like to see something that the internal combustion engine ban has in place. And I'm not an expert on it, but I understand there are for the companies involved, the manufacturers of engines involved, there are also sort of sub-targets and sub-regulatory measures that enforce sort of an improvement in efficiency for electric vehicles and so on over time as well. And I think we need something like that in the gas boiler industry to push the switch over to heat pumps and make sure that the focus turns to heat pumps and the manufacture of heat pumps and gets the costs down, improves the efficiency where it can be done. That kind of thing will be very important as well.
Thanks, Dan. David?
Yeah, so in some ways I could probably give a similar answer to question 2 in terms of technology saverism and waiting for the big disruptive thing to happen. I mean, the analogy with electric vehicles isn't perfect, because I think the service provided by a car is a bit simpler than the service that we require in our houses for thermal comfort. So the relationship between the technology providing the service and the service itself is a bit more complex, and so you have to be this kind of touches on what John Council said earlier today, but you have to be a bit careful making sort of blanket assumptions behind a technology that will work for a certain type of house, because there are variations in our building stock, but also the way that we interact with those buildings and the technologies. And I think it's interesting to compare how sort of heating has evolved over time, and also cooling as a requirement has evolved over time in different countries. And again, the role of the technology within there, it's not always the case that a technology comes in and the pattern to our heating or the pattern to our cooling changes. It tends to be a bit more kind of gradual than that, and there's this relationship between our between, as I said, the service itself. So the switch from Thames gas to natural gas is maybe something we can learn from in terms of disruptive technologies. But that wasn't just about technology, that was about available resource, and then kind of kicking on from there a few decades later, the growth of central heating. There was obviously a technological aspect of that, but our relationship with heating changed. And if we're waiting for this disruptive technology to come in, we have to account that it might not be a like-for-like replacement of an existing technology, and as a result, all our other assumptions around heating or cooling have to be completely revised. Just to maybe answer the question a bit more sort of genuinely and less vaguely, I think one interesting thing that might change in the future is around demand flexibility and demand flexibility services. So bringing in the consumer, the householder potentially, as a beneficiary of demand flexibility, which isn't something that a current householder would be sort of familiar with necessarily. But I think if that works at scale, then that changes the way we heat and cool our buildings, the way we use energy as consumers, the way we think about the service being provided by that energy. So that could be something that is significantly disruptive in terms of our relationship with our own buildings.
Thanks, David. And Huashan?
Yes, I think what I like to answer for this question already covered by David, Dan, and Bill, and in this question also previous question. So just briefly summarize my thoughts in this. I think it's imperative to have tighter building regulations, and it's very important to improve energy efficiency of the housing stock and to reduce the energy demand and to make the housing stock suitable for low carbon heating systems. And it's also very important to prepare construction professionals and supply chains for working in higher specification in the future.
Okay, well, actually, that's perfect timing because that's now exactly 45 minutes and 1:15, which is our allotted stopping time for this session. So I'd like to conclude this session, and I'd like to thank Dan, Meredith, David, Jenkins, Huashan, Boeing, Bill Kirkup for their time and their input this lunchtime. They've had to do a little bit of research, I think, potentially around some of those questions. So I thank them for doing that.